I don't know if I know what a right is legally. And Harry, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, the rights of the child, and as something that we don't even know about it in the U.S. I'm sure you stop a kid on the street and he has no idea that he or she has rights, according to the United Nations. So, sorry if I put the two questions together, but.
Well, one of the rights question is really fascinating. The legal system is supposedly organized around rights. On the other hand, it's hard to say what a right is if some alien person is evaluating whether or not you have one. So, but one of the brightest and certainly most famous Supreme Court justices, Oliver Wendell Holmes, said he didn't believe in rights. He thought that what was happening in different cases was this is a very elitist point of view, but it's helpful, is that his view of what the court was doing was not evaluating or weighing different rights or saying whether you had a right or didn't have a right, but what the court was doing was deciding whether or not the overall interest of the society was advanced by according the plaintiff or the claimant the relief that they were seeking. So he had a very non-rights view of the legal system, and probably a more evaluative sense, or even more modernist scientific sense of what they were doing. So I think I find that helpful, because the rights, I don't know, the rights thing is hard because you have two sides and each side claims it has a right. So how do you resolve that? I was thinking of this quote off of some work we were doing in Fred's developmental philosophy group, that at the end of the Civil War, at his second inaugural, Abraham Lincoln commented on how strange it was to have a God to which both sides of this conflict about whether slavery should be allowed to continue were appealing, and each side was absolutely sure that God was on their side. So the whole rights issue, I think is a troubling one, actually. And I think in some ways what you're saying is an instantiation of that. So what does it mean to have a right to sit in a building, when, you're ignored?
Right.
Anyway.
Right.
So.
There's no budget.
Right. Yeah.
I think it's interesting because I feel like, Harry knows more. I don't know anything about law or rights, but I know that, I know that there's these international treaties, right? The we haven't signed a women's rights one either. We don't sign treaties. We draft them, actually. We're very involved in the drafting of them, and we don't sign them. But
because of the sovereign rights of America.
Right, exactly.
Not be subject to the treaty.
Exactly. So, and in the international community, people take them pretty seriously. Like there's policy after policy drafted about these things, and implementation strategies put into play, and programming built around them, and in a way that we don't have here. Like we don't. I don't know enough to know how the things are being driven, but I see it there. That there's, you look at these country level policies. There's hundreds of them drafted off of each treaty. So something's happening. I'm not sure. What's challenging to me is whether or not those have anything to do with what happens in everyday life for a young person. I'm not sure yet, and one of the things I guess I'm being tasked to do is seeing if it does, which will be a fascinating question. Right now, for example, I've been just doing a survey of 178 countries, policies, strategies, guidances, all of this stuff they call in knowledge about adolescent rights and development, and then seeing if there's any relationship to that, all of that stuff, and the programs on the ground. And so far, nothing. I can't see any relationship at all.
Well, obviously, it makes a difference to an African American or a woman, whether or not, or a non-property holder. Those are some of the categories that were accorded the right to vote or fought and won the right to vote. So obviously that's very important. And But I don't know what the use of the word right adds to that. You know, I mean, what that confers. I mean, the society should have allowed everybody to vote from the beginning, and it took the abolitionist movement and the suffrage movement, you know, to change that and to expand the franchise. So in some ways, the right is really the product of a civil war or a power struggle or politics.
Right.
But to the individuals who are asserting that right or claiming that right, it's very, very important. So it's a funny kind of a thing, the right, in that sense.
Well, it makes me think about enabling environment. I was thinking about the flip side of the enabling. To what extent is the civil rights movement, those are the enabling environment?
Right.
Like the way you were describing it defines enabling environment as
Right.
coming from the top down.
Yeah.
It ignores the fact that all the rights we had,
Came from the
as
bottom.
far as I can tell,
That's right.
even like I think about the Declaration of the inalienable rights. If you believe they existed from God, the fact was it took a movement of people
Right.
Right.
standing up and saying these are our rights to make them anything. So there is a way it's turned around as if the rights come from
From the
here.
top, yeah.
Um,
I've been thinking that this is an interesting kind of, well, I have lots of things to say about. One is that, and what does it mean to have a right to participate in a quote, and I think what they mean is a democratic process in some way when they talk about it in a country that has no democracy. I mean, it's kind, it's kind of wild to even think about. And then I've been thinking a lot about what is happening in the U.S. around, youth-led social change movements and that kind of work. One thing I guess I've often thought that would be helpful here is that I work in like hundreds of youth-led social change organizations around this country. And, they all have issues, like, they all have their own issue area, lesbian, gay, transgendered groups, disabled groups, they all have a particular kind of issue that they're going in with, right? And one of the things that's challenging is that they're not at the table. Like, they have to fight both to be at the table because they're young people and to bring up their issue at a table, but they have to fight first to get to the table. So in some ways, it's interesting because we have a fairly strong movement of young people here who don't even have the right to be at the table.
Right.
So in some ways, we're coming from the bottom up, and we're seeing the rest of the kind of world move from the top down, and it's interesting to see
One of the things about rights, which I'm thinking as you're talking, is how caught up, I don't even know if this is necessary or the only way it could be, but rights seem very caught up with identity politics.
Yeah.
So in some funny way, rights divide people rather than bring people together. Even though, in theory, according everyone the same rights would create some form of equality and cooperation, but it doesn't seem to work that way in some funny way. So that's one of the contradictions of a right-based policy.